Hey friends, I'm the storyteller. Before you get too comfortable, do me a small favor, hit like and subscribe, but only if you really enjoy this kind of storytelling. And while you're here, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I always love seeing how far these stories reach. Christine Marie Paulilla was born on the 31st of March, 1986 in Long Island, New York. Her parents were Charles, a construction worker, and Lori, a stay-at-home mom. When Christine was just 2 years old, everything in her world changed. Her father, Charles, died in a tragic accident at work, killed suddenly on a construction site. And for Christine, even at such a young age, that loss left a deep, invisible mark. Her mother, Lori, didn't cope well. She began using drugs. And over time, she spiraled into addiction, multiple substances, heavy use, total dependency. Eventually, it got to the point where she lost custody of both Christine and her older brother. They were placed in the care of their grandparents. Christine was around 5 years old, still so small, still trying to understand the world. And then, her hair began falling out. At night, strands would come out in clumps. Bald patches appeared on her scalp. She lost her eyelashes, her eyebrows. Her grandparents took her to the doctor, and that's when they learned the diagnosis: alopecia. At just 5 years old, Christine was losing her hair. And for a little girl especially, one already coping with so much that took a massive toll. She didn't feel pretty. She didn't feel normal. She stopped feeling like herself. And the kids at school didn't make it any easier. They didn't understand what alopecia was. They laughed, they pointed, they called her names. Her grandparents tried to help. They bought her wigs, hoping it would give her back some confidence, a way to feel girly again, a way to fit in. But it only made things worse. Kids would sneak up behind her, rip off the wig, and laugh. They were cruel. And Christine just grew quieter, sadder, and more withdrawn. But Christine wasn't only bullied for her hair loss or the wigs. She also had severely poor eyesight, which meant she had to wear thick, heavy glasses, the kind that kids can be cruel about, the kind that drew attention, the kind that made her stand out for all the wrong reasons. And so they made fun of that too. Her glasses, her hair, her silence. Christine struggled. She was insecure, shy, and never liked putting herself out there. And that made everything worse. She found it hard to connect with people, to make friends, to feel seen. Sure, there were classmates she could talk to, but she didn't have a group. She didn't have a best friend. And that loneliness followed her all the way through her early teenage years. Then, something unexpected happened. Her mother, Lori, who had once been lost to addiction, turned her life around. She got clean. She remarried. She rebuilt stability for herself and for her family, and eventually she was able to regain custody of Christine and her older brother. When Christine was 17 years old, they moved to Clear Lake, a quiet, upscale suburb of Houston, Texas, a safe, family-centered area, a place where kids rode bikes on sidewalks and parents waved at each other from their driveways. It was a fresh start. Christine enrolled at Clear Lake High School. And after her very first day there, she came home different. Her mother noticed it immediately. Christine was beaming happy in a way she hadn't been in years. She ran up to her mom, bubbling with excitement, and said, "I made 2 friends today, the sweetest girls I've ever met. Their names were Rachel Colarudis and Tiffany Rawl. They were the kind of girls who, from the outside, might seem like the typical popular girls. But they weren't mean. They weren't cruel. They were warm, open, kind." Rachel was known for being genuinely kind-hearted. She was creative, artistic, and deeply empathetic, always rooting for the underdog. Tiffany had a gift for acting. She loved being on stage and was often cast in school plays. But more than anything, her dream was to become a social worker, someone who could help people, especially kids. And with Christine, they just clicked. The 3 of them quickly became inseparable. They'd visit each other's homes, laugh endlessly, share secrets, and lift each other up. Christine's mom noticed that when Rachel and Tiffany were around, her daughter was glowing. She was laughing again. She was confident. She was engaged in life. She was creating, trying hard in school again, just happy. It was like watching her daughter come back to life. As Christine grew closer to Rachel and Tiffany, she began to open up. She confided in them about her insecurities, her hair, her glasses, the bullying she had endured for most of her life. And of course, being who they were, Rachel and Tiffany didn't just listen. They wanted to help. They bought her a new Wygon that suited her better, made her feel more like herself. They taught her how to do her makeup, how to bring out her natural beauty. They even helped her transition from thick glasses to contact lenses, and the difference it made was huge. Christine's confidence began to bloom noticeably. To everyone around her, it was like watching a transformation. By 2003, Christine had gone from shy and withdrawn to someone who carried herself with presence. She was even voted Miss Irresistible by her classmates, a title given not just for looks, but for the energy she gave off. She was radiant, confident. She walked through the halls like someone who had finally stepped into her own skin. But around that same time, everything began to change again. That was when Christine met Chris Snyder. She was 17. He was 21. And while the age gap didn't bother Christine's parents too much, there was something else about Chris that did. He had a criminal record, a long list of charges, including violence. He was also known to experiment with drugs, often and heavily. It wasn't clear yet if he was addicted, but he was already headed down that road. Christine's mother and stepfather didn't approve. Neither did Rachel and Tiffany. Chris didn't fit into their world. Rachel and Tiffany were kind, creative, and clean. They didn't do drugs, didn't get in trouble, didn't run in dark circles. They were good kids. And now, Christine was bringing someone into their lives who was the complete opposite. Before long, Christine began experimenting with drugs herself. She started pulling away from her family, from her friends, from the version of herself that had finally started to shine. Whether it was because Chris influenced her or because Christine simply no longer felt like she belonged in her old world, she began to isolate herself, and things got worse. Christine's mother believes that the relationship between Christine and Chris was mutually abusive. Christine had become intensely jealous and at times unstable. After one fight between them, Christine refused to leave Chris's house. She was angry, emotional, and out of control. When Chris tried to push her away, she didn't go. Instead, she laid down on his front lawn and stayed there through the night. She told him that if he called the police or tried to force her to leave, she would kill his entire family. As Christine's relationship with Chris Snyder deepened, she began to change completely. It wasn't just her habits or her choices. It was her entire personality. She no longer fit in with the friend group that had once felt like home. But it's important to say they never pushed her away. Rachel and Tiffany, true to who they were, didn't abandon her. They didn't cut her off. They didn't turn their backs, because even with the changes, even with the distance, they still loved her. But Christine just wasn't like them anymore. She didn't feel comfortable around her friends. She didn't feel like she belonged in her own family either. And so she pulled further into the one place she did feel understood her relationship with Chris. Even though it was toxic, even though it was abusive on both sides, that relationship became her entire world. Meanwhile, the rest of the group continued on, just without her. They didn't cut her off completely. They'd still invite her every now and then. But they knew if they invited Christine, she'd probably bring Chris. And that changed the atmosphere. So they started to distance themselves. Not out of cruelty, just out of quiet caution. At this point, the core group was still Rachel and Tiffany. Tiffany had a boyfriend named Marcus, and he often hung out with them. And now, Marcus's cousin, a guy named Adalbert, had recently moved into the neighborhood, so he started spending time with the group as well. They were close. They were connected. And Christine was slowly on the outside looking in. On the 18th of July, 2003, the group we've been following, Tiffany, Rachel, Marcus, and Adalbert, were spending the afternoon together at Tiffany's house. It wasn't unusual. Tiffany's home had become the unofficial hangout spot for their group. It used to be her family home, but now Tiffany lived there alone. Her father had moved out to live with a woman he'd met, and the house had kind of become a place of freedom for her and her friends. There were no parents, no rules, and at their age, 18 to 20 years old, it was ideal. That day was no different. It started out simple, just the four of them. Movies, pizza, easy conversation. The kind of summer day where no one expected anything except laughter and the comfort of familiar faces. Later that evening, they were planning to have more people over. Tiffany had already invited a bunch of friends to come by for a small get-together. The plan was for everyone to arrive around 6 p.m. One of the girls who had been invited was someone referred to publicly as Brittany, not her real name for reasons that have never been explained. Brittany called the house around 3 p.m. just to double-check the plans. But Tiffany wasn't available, she was in the bathroom. So her boyfriend, Marcus, answered the phone instead. Brittany just said she'd call back later. An hour passed. Around 4 p.m., she tried again. But this time, no one answered. Not Marcus, not Tiffany, no one. Still, Brittany didn't think too much of it. Maybe they were just busy. So she and a few others decided to stick with the plan and head to the house around 6:30 p.m. as expected. When they arrived, they walked up to the front door and knocked. No answer. They knocked again and again. Still nothing. But they could hear the television inside, it was still on. What they didn't hear was any laughter, any footsteps, any voices. It wasn't just that they weren't being let in. It was like the house was frozen. Eventually, one of the teens reached for the doorknob just to check. It was unlocked. They slowly pushed the door open and walked into a nightmare. All four teenagers were inside Tiffany, Rachel, Marcus, and Adelbert. They had all been shot. There was blood everywhere. The scene was silent, unmoving. Completely still except for the television still humming in the background. The teens who found them ran straight back outside. They banged on a neighbor's door, and that neighbor called the police. When police arrived at the house, they began carefully examining the scene, and it was clear this attack had caught the teenagers completely off guard. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no evidence that anyone had tried to run or fight back except maybe one. Tiffany and Marcus were still sitting on the couch, their legs reclined, just as if they had still been watching the movie. They were probably killed right there without ever moving. Adelbert was lying on the floor in front of the sofa. It's unclear whether he had gotten up during the attack or if he had already been down there when it started. Only Rachel seemed to have moved. She was found behind the sofa. There was a trail of blood behind her, as though she had tried to drag herself after being shot. And just beside her, on the floor, police found a phone. They checked it and saw that Rachel had managed to dial 911 before she was killed. She had tried to call for help, but she didn't make it. The room itself was covered in blood. There were signs of multiple gunshots in the walls, on the furniture, even on the ceiling. Some bullets had passed through the victims, then embedded themselves in the drywall. There were pools of blood on the floor. The air must have been filled with smoke and silence. By the time police were done processing the scene, they had counted 24 bullets fired inside the room. 17 of those had hit their targets. 17 shots that found a human being. But beyond the shell casings, there was nothing. No weapon, no fingerprints, no trace of the killer. It was, at that moment, a completely cold scene. The bodies were taken for autopsy. And while it was confirmed that Tiffany, Marcus, and Adelbert had all died from gunshot wounds, Rachel's cause of death was different. She had been shot 6 times, mostly in the lower abdomen and genital area. But that's not what killed her. She had been hit in the head blunt force trauma with the butt of the gun. That was her actual cause of death, meaning after being shot, she had still been alive. She tried to crawl. She tried to survive. She tried to call for help. And one of the killers found her and finished it. When police examined the bullet casings found at the scene, they noticed something striking. The casings came from 2 different types of bullets, which meant they had been fired from 2 separate guns. And that opened up a whole new possibility. There may not have been just one killer. there may have been two or even more. Based on what they knew, investigators theorized that there could have been 2 to 4 shooters involved. They also looked closely at the placement of the gunshot wounds, particularly on Rachel and Tiffany. As mentioned earlier, both girls had been shot multiple times in the lower abdomen and genital area. And that specific pattern, especially when it's deliberate, can sometimes hint at something deeper than just random violence. If the shooter was male, wounds like that can indicate a crime of passion or hatred toward the feminine, either directed at someone the killer once loved and now resented, or rooted in misogyny, rage, or humiliation. If the shooter was female, however, the implication is often more internal. It can come from insecurity, envy, or a deep sense of inferiority. A need to erase the femininity of others of girls who are seen as more beautiful, more popular, more everything. Of course, none of that was certain yet. Because the truth was, they had no idea who had done this. There was no evidence left at the scene, no weapons, no fingerprints, no DNA, nothing, which made it almost impossible to figure out who the killers were or why they did it. And that was what made this crime even harder to process for the investigators and for the entire community. Because these weren't kids in gangs, they weren't involved in anything dangerous, they were just good kids. Kind, smart, well-loved. Tiffany and Rachel were known for being generous, supportive, and warm to everyone around them. And Adalbert had only just moved to Clear Lake. He came from a tougher area, somewhere more dangerous, and he had been trying to get away from all that. He had only been in Clear Lake for 2 weeks before he was murdered. The entire city was in shock, and so was Christine Paolillo. Even though she had been distancing herself from Rachel and Tiffany in the months leading up to the murders, the moment she heard the news, she fell apart. Christine was devastated. She cried constantly. She couldn't go to work. She couldn't even function. A photo of Christine was later found in Rachel Colorutis' wallet, proof that even though their friendship had drifted, the love was still there. They had still cared about each other. And now, they were gone. Christine couldn't sleep. She couldn't eat. For 3 nights straight, she slept in her mother and stepfather's bed because being alone in the dark in her own room was just too much. She was overwhelmed. She was drowning in grief. And no one, not her family, not the community, had any idea what was really coming. While Christine was struggling with grief, police were working relentlessly behind the scenes, trying to get any kind of lead because as it stood, they had nothing. So they started simple. They went to Tiffany's neighbors, hoping that someone, anyone, might have seen or heard something on the day of the murders. One neighbor mentioned hearing loud banging around 3:30 p.m., but they didn't think much of it at the time. They just assumed someone was doing construction nearby, maybe hammering wood or fixing something around the house. In hindsight, though, it was probably the gunshots. Another neighbor had something more specific to say. They remembered seeing 2 people walking down the street toward Tiffany's house around 3 p.m., a man and a woman, both dressed in all black. At the time, it hadn't seemed suspicious. Just 2 people walking in broad daylight, so the neighbor didn't really focus on their faces, didn't take note of their behavior, didn't realize what was about to happen. But there were a few details they did remember. The woman had a bandana over her hair, making it hard to tell what kind of hair she had. And one feature stood out to the witness. She had unusually large eyes. That was all they had to go on. Still, police worked with that neighbor to create composite sketches based on the descriptions. Even the neighbor admitted they didn't think the sketches would be very helpful. The memory was vague. They hadn't paid close attention, but police had to try. The sketches were printed, broadcast on the news, posted around town, but nothing came of it. No tips, no solid leads, nothing. So police turned to Clear Lake High School. They started interviewing the victim's classmates, hoping to uncover a motive, a grudge, anything that could explain why these 4 teenagers had been targeted. And surprisingly, they found out some things they hadn't expected. They discovered that Marcus, Tiffany's boyfriend, had allegedly been dealing drugs, a potential red flag. It introduced the possibility that this might have been a drug deal gone wrong. Then there was Adalbert. Police learned that he had some distant connections to the Mexican mafia, which on paper sounded serious, even terrifying. But after looking into it, they couldn't find any real links between the cartel and the murders in Clear Lake. Still, of all the theories, the drug angle started to feel the most plausible to police. There weren't any obvious personal enemies, no jealous exes, no violent confrontations in their past. So this theory that someone connected to drugs had come looking for money, revenge, or silence became the main working motive. Police started looking for suspects, but there weren't any strong ones. No fingerprints, no security footage, no weapons, just rumors, frustration, dead ends. They kept investigating. They chased every lead they could find. But like many cases that start out with no evidence, the momentum began to fade. Weeks turned into months. Months turned into years. And eventually, the case went cold. But while the investigation stalled, Rachel's father refused to give up. He couldn't accept that his daughter and her 3 friends had been brutally murdered, and no one was being held responsible. So he made a decision. If the police couldn't solve it, he would. He started raising money, determined to pursue every lead himself. And over the next 4 years, he managed to raise over $100,000. He used most of that money to launch his own kind of manhunt. He focused on the 2 composite sketches, the man and woman in black, the only real clues they had. He made it his mission to get those faces everywhere. He had the sketches reprinted, plastered, broadcasted. He bought advertising space, took out spots on local news stations, and most notably, he rented out nearly every billboard across Clear Lake City. And on every single one of them, those 2 faces, they were placed at every entrance and exit of the city, so no one could come into or leave Clear Lake without seeing them. It was massive, and it worked. This sudden citywide push brought the case back to life. People started talking again. The public memory was stirred. Everyone in town was discussing the murders once more, and especially those mysterious 2 people in black. Police began receiving hundreds of call tips, guesses, sightings, anything. Most of them led nowhere. But then one call stood out, and that single call would shine a light on a lead that, up until that point, no one had really considered. The massive push from Rachel's father, the billboards, the television coverage, the posters really did its job. It brought the case back into the public eye. Everyone in Clear Lake was talking again, talking about the murders, talking about the composite sketches. And as a result, police were flooded with tip-shundries of calls from people who thought they might have recognized someone in the drawings. Most of those leads led nowhere. A lot of callers thought they recognized the faces, but when police followed up, the information never really panned out. Until one call changed everything. A man called Crime Stoppers anonymously. He said he recognized the woman in the sketch, not just from the street or in passing, but from drug rehab. He said they had met during treatment. And during their time together, she had confided in him. And what she told him chilled him to the core. She told him that she had been involved in a quadruple homicide. She gave him details, very specific ones, details that had never been made public. She said she had run out of bullets. She said she had to hit one of the victims over the head to kill them. She even mentioned that one of the victims had been trying to dial 911 when they were shot. It lined up exactly with what had happened to Rachel Colorutis. So naturally, police were immediately interested. They asked the caller, "Who do you think this woman is? What's her name?" And the man answered, "Christine Paulia." Police pulled up Christine's name in their system, looked at her picture, her background, her current details. And when they saw her photo, it was almost a perfect match to the sketch. The resemblance was uncanny. They also noticed something else. Christine had racked up a long criminal record stretching from shortly after the murders all the way to the present day. Drug charges, mostly. Possession, minor offenses. And most troubling of all, she was listed as having a severe heroin addiction. At that time, she was 20 years old, married, and living in a motel in San Antonio. So the police tracked her down. They located the motel and moved in to make an arrest. But when they arrived, what they found shocked even the most seasoned officers. The motel room Christine was staying in was, according to some officers, worse than homicide scenes they'd worked before. The air was thick with rot. The walls and floors were covered in grime, bloodstains, and filth. There were used needles scattered everywhere. Some still had blood in them. Others were broken, bent, or left open. Many were still in their plastic wrappers, never used. Some were buried under moldy food, dirty laundry, and garbage. There were hundreds of syringes, some open, some capped. Some had blood dried into them. There was no clear space on the floor or bed. One officer said the stench was among the worst they had ever encountered in their career. And at the center of it all, Christine Paolilla. By the time police found her, Christine Paolilla had barely left her motel room in the past 8 months. She wasn't working. She wasn't going outside. Her life had become a full descent into addiction. She later admitted that she was spending around $1,000 a day on heroin. It was all being funded by money that should have changed her life for the better. When Christine had turned 18, she received a $300,000 payout from her father's life insurance, a result of the tragic construction accident that took his life when she was just 2 years old. But instead of saving it, investing, or starting over, Christine and her husband Justin spent nearly every cent of it on drugs. They burned through that money year after year, thousands at a time, just to feed their habits. So when police arrested them at the motel, they took both of them in for questioning. At that point, all investigators knew was that the original witness sketch showed a man and a woman. That was it. So naturally, police assumed that the killers were Christine and her husband Justin. But once inside the interrogation room, the stories began to unravel. Christine immediately shut down. She refused to speak without a lawyer. She didn't say a word. But Justin did. He had no reason to stay silent, wasn't involved in the murders, and he knew it. So he told police everything Christine had ever told him. He told them that Christine had confessed more than once that she and her ex-boyfriend, Chris Snyder, were the real killers. Back in 2003, Christine and Chris were already heavily using drugs. Whether they were addicted yet or not isn't clear, but they were definitely spiraling. They used often. They used a lot. And on that day in July 2003, they wanted to get high, but they didn't have any drugs. And they didn't have money. So they came up with a plan. They knew that Tiffany and Rachel were hanging out that day. They figured they could rob them, maybe get some money, maybe some pills or drugs. They thought it would be easy. So Christine and Chris went straight to Tiffany's house. When they got there, it was Rachel who answered the door. She opened it without hesitation. She didn't think twice. This was Christine, her old friend, someone she trusted for years. Why would she ever think something was wrong? Inside, Tiffany, Marcus, and Adelbert were all still on the couch watching a movie. Everything was calm, normal. Christine and Chris came in. They all exchanged hellos. There was nothing out of the ordinary until everything changed. Chris suddenly pulled out a gun, and Christine, just a beat behind him, pulled out hers. Then they both began shouting, demanding that all 4 people in the room hand over money, drugs, and anything else they had. A robbery. From someone they thought was a friend. So like I mentioned earlier, when Christine and Chris entered the house, Rachel Colarutis was still standing. She had just opened the door to let them in. The others, Tiffany, Marcus, and Adelbert, were still sitting on the couch watching the movie. That's when Christine decided to focus on Rachel. She was the only one standing. The only one not frozen in place by fear. So while Chris held the others at gunpoint, ordering them to stay seated and not move, Christine took Rachel around the house, searching for money or drugs, anything they could steal to fund their next high. But this wasn't Rachel's house. She didn't live there. She wouldn't know where anything valuable was kept, and it's unclear if they even found anything. What is clear is that once they finished searching, reality hit them both. They couldn't just walk out the door and leave, because the 4 people inside that house knew exactly who they were. These weren't strangers. These were Christine's friends. And if any of them survived, she and Chris would be arrested for armed robbery. So they made a decision. According to Christine's later statements, it was Chris who began shooting. She claimed she never pulled the trigger, that she only stood there while he fired at all 4 victims. But forensics told a different story. There were 2 different types of bullet casings found at the scene, which strongly suggests that both Christine and Chris fired their weapons. They didn't stop until all 4 teenagers were down. Then they fled. They ran out of Tiffany's house, jumped into Chris's car, and prepared to drive away. But then Christine began to panic. She started thinking, what if one of them is still alive? What if someone saw us? She couldn't risk it, so she got out of the car. She went back into the house alone this time to make sure that no one had survived. She walked up to the bodies one by one. She shot Marcus, Adalbert, and Tiffany again, each of them once more, just to be sure. But she couldn't find Rachel. Rachel's body was no longer where they left her. Christine looked around, confused, until she heard a faint noise coming from behind the couch. She went around to look, and there was Rachel, still alive, bleeding heavily, trying to dial 911. Christine raised her gun, tried to fire, but she was out of bullets, so instead, she walked up to Rachel and began beating her with the gun itself, over and over again, until she stopped moving, until the room was silent again. Then Christine fled for real this time. She got into the car with Chris. They drove back to Christine's house, where they washed themselves off, cleaned up the blood, and got rid of the evidence. And then, as if nothing had happened, Chris drove Christine to work. She had a shift at the Walgreens makeup counter. And that's what she did. After murdering 4 people, including girls who had once been her closest friends, Christine worked a full shift behind the beauty counter, smiling at customers, wearing her uniform. Just another normal day. As I mentioned before, police have found virtually no evidence at the crime scene. No DNA, no fingerprints, no weapons, no cameras. And that's exactly how Christine and Chris got away with it for so long. There was simply nothing to go on. After the murders, Christine and Chris stayed together. They remained in a relationship for a full year, united by a secret that no one else knew. But in 2005, things began to shift. Chris Snyder was caught trying to steal a car, and as a result, he was sent to prison for a few years. And with him gone, Christine began to feel like maybe she had a chance to reclaim her life. She broke things off with Chris. She entered rehab, hoping to get clean from the drugs that had consumed her life. And for a while, it worked. During her time in rehab, she met a man named Justin Rott. The two grew close, and eventually, they got married. They both completed rehab, and when they got out, they tried to start over. But not long after, they relapsed. And with that relapse came a flood of trauma that Christine had been trying to bury for years. One day, she sat down with Justin, and maybe out of guilt or a moment of emotional collapse, she told him everything. The murders, the victims, the house, Rachel's 911 call, every detail. She let it all out. And from that moment forward, something inside Christine broke. She became paralyzed with fear, consumed by anxiety, haunted by her own confession. She couldn't leave the house anymore. So she and Justin sold the home, a home Christine had once bought using the money from her father's life insurance. She didn't want to live in Clear Lake anymore. She couldn't. So instead, they moved into a motel, somewhere quiet, somewhere off the grid. And that's where Christine shut herself in. 8 full months. She didn't leave the room. She didn't go outside. She just sank further into addiction, fear, and isolation. Meanwhile, police continued their investigation. And once they had Christine's name, they naturally looked into the man she had committed the murders with, Chris Snyder. They ran a background check and found that Chris was now living in Florida with a woman he had met online. In June 2006, police officially issued a warrant for the arrest of Chris Snyder. But somehow, word of that warrant got out. Chris found out that the police were looking for him, that he was now a wanted man. And before anyone could reach him, he disappeared, vanished. Because of his history and the nature of the case, he a very intense, high-priority missing person search began almost immediately. Chris Snyder wasn't just missing. He was a potential murderer, a threat to the public, and possibly even a danger to himself. For weeks, no one knew where he had gone. Then, in August, about a month after he vanished, a tip came in. Someone reported that they had seen Chris Snyder around the time of his disappearance walking into a wooded area. So the police went there to check, and that's where they found him. Chris Snyder's body was discovered in a state of decomposition, hidden deep in the trees. He had overdosed on prescription drugs, taken his own life before the justice system ever could. He would never face trial, never answer for the murders of 4 innocent teenagers. But the police didn't stop there. They searched Chris's home, and what they found was deeply telling. They discovered 2 handguns that matched the types of guns used in the 2003 murders. And, unbelievably, on one of those guns they found traces of DNA, not just Chris Snyder's, but Rachel Colarutis' DNA as well, still present. After 3 years, that gun was now physical confirmation of what Christine had already admitted. Eventually, Christine Paulilla confessed to her involvement in all 4 murders. But because she was still a juvenile at the time the crimes were committed, she was not eligible for the death penalty. In October 2008, Christine was officially found guilty of all 4 murders. The court sentenced her to life in prison. Since then, Christine has tried to appeal her sentence multiple times, but each time, the courts have rejected her requests. Her first chance at parole will be in the year 2046, when she is 60 years old.